$1 million can buy a lot of things in Manhattan, Claire Bennett would remember later, but it can't buy 10 minutes from someone who still knows her own worth. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The crystal room glowed like a jewelry box under low amber chandeliers, every wine glass catching light, every whispered laugh polished to perfection. The kind of place where men in tailored suits ordered truffle fries without looking at the menu, and women wore diamonds as casually as wristwatches. Claire moved through it like she always did, quiet, precise, unreadable. White shirt, black vest, hairpin back, order pad tucked neatly into her apron. At first glance, she looked like every other waitress in the city, efficient, forgettable, easy to underestimate. But there was nothing careless about the way she set down a glass of still water exactly 2 inches from the edge of a linen tablecloth, or the way her eyes flicked once to a platinum watch before she looked back at the man wearing it. Ethan Blackwell sat at the center of the room like the place had been built around him. 38. White. Billionaire. The kind of man whose name opened doors before he touched the handle. His dark suit fit like a second skin. His voice never rose above conversation level, and yet every person at his table leaned in when he spoke. Hedge fund partners. A celebrity attorney. A private equity friend with a laugh too loud for the room. A woman from public relations who checked every face before she smiled. They had been drinking for over an hour, though Ethan himself barely seemed affected. He wasn't sloppy. He wasn't reckless. That was what made him dangerous. That's the one of the men said, nodding toward Claire as she returned with a bottle of Napa Cabernet. She's the only person in this place who hasn't looked impressed all night. A ripple of amusement moved around the table. Ethan glanced up then, really looked at her for the first time, and something subtle shifted in his expression. Not attraction exactly. Curiosity. The colder kind. Maybe she's smart, the PR woman said lightly. Or maybe she just knows who signs the check, another man replied, and that got a bigger laugh. Claire poured the wine without reacting. Not a flinch, not a smile. Her face stayed composed, her hand steady, her voice soft when she asked if anyone wanted fresh pepper with the ribeye. You know my favorite thing about money? Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping once against the stem of his glass. The table quieted. They knew he liked an audience. It doesn't change people, he said. It reveals them. Someone chuckled. Someone murmured, that's good. Then Ethan reached for the leather check folder left behind from an earlier round of cocktails. He slid out the receipt, uncapped a black fountain pen, and wrote a number on the back in slow, deliberate strokes. Even from where she stood, Claire could see the commas. He placed the receipt flat on the white tablecloth like he was laying down a card in a private game. Miss, he said, his tone smooth enough to sound polite from across the room. $1 million. Claire turned. Every sound in the room seemed to thin for half a second. Excuse me, sir? He looked directly at her now, blue-gray eyes cool, unreadable, the ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth. $1 million, he repeated, tapping the receipt once with the pen. To sit with me for 10 minutes. A few people at the table laughed too fast, like they thought they were supposed to. Others didn't. Claire looked at the number, then at the man, then at the men watching him. She understood it instantly. It wasn't a proposition. It was theater, a test dressed up like a joke. If she blushed, they would smirk. If she snapped, she'd be emotional. If she walked away, Ethan would tell himself he had proven some private theory about pride. Somewhere behind her, she heard the maitre d' inhale sharply. The bartender froze mid-pour. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to miss a note. Claire did none of the things they expected. She stepped closer to the table. Calm. Measured. She picked up the receipt between 2 fingers, glanced at the number once more, then set it back down exactly where he had placed it. Her eyes lifted to Ethan's, steady as glass. Only if your legal team drafts it first, Mr. Blackwell, she said. This time, no one laughed. For one long second, the entire crystal room forgot how to breathe. Ethan Blackwell did not move. The pen remained in his hand, suspended just above the white tablecloth, while the number on the back of the receipt seemed to glow under the chandelier light like something dangerous and absurd. Around him, faces changed in sequence. Amusement first, then confusion, then the slow, unmistakable discomfort of people realizing the joke had just turned around and was now staring back at them. Claire Bennett stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly against the leather folder, her expression calm enough to be mistaken for polite. But there was nothing submissive in it. She had not raised her voice. She had not smiled. She had simply changed the terms of the room. "I am sorry," the celebrity attorney at Ethan's table said at last, leaning forward with narrowed eyes. "Did you just ask for a contract?" Claire turned her head slightly, not enough to break posture. "If Mr. Blackwell is offering compensation in exchange for my time, proximity, and public association, then yes. I would need terms in writing." Her tone was even, clear, the kind of voice that made people listen harder because it never begged to be heard. A soft laugh came from the private equity friend, but it died almost immediately when Claire looked at him. Not rudely, just directly. 10 minutes can mean many things in a room like this, she continued. A social appearance, a publicity stunt, a humiliation ritual disguised as generosity. I would prefer clarity. The words landed with surgical precision. Across the table, the woman from public relations slowly lowered her champagne glass. She was the first to understand exactly how bad this could become. Ethan's blue-gray eyes stayed on Claire, unreadable now, the amusement almost gone. "You think I am trying to humiliate you?" he asked. Claire did not answer right away. She glanced once at the faces around him, the expensive watches, the loosened ties, the people waiting to see which version of this story they would get to tell later. Then she looked back at him. "I think you are used to being entertained by your own power, Mr. Blackwell." Silence. Real silence this time. Not the polished kind. The kind that exposed everyone in it. Somewhere near the bar, a fork slipped against a plate with a tiny metallic sound that felt too loud. Ethan set the pen down. Slowly. "Interesting," he said, though there was no humor left in the word. Claire reached into her apron and pulled out a small server's notepad, flipping it open with practiced ease. "If you are serious," she said, "I would need a written agreement covering duration, purpose, compensation trigger, confidentiality, image rights, and a clear statement that this arrangement is professional in nature and does not imply personal access beyond the exact 10 minutes specified." The attorney at the table blinked. The private equity friend stopped smiling entirely. "Image rights," he repeated. Claire nodded once. "You are in a room full of people with phones, social media accounts, assistants, and opinions. If a photograph appears online without context, I become the story. If the story becomes ugly, I lose more than 10 minutes. That one hit. The PR woman leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "She is not wrong." Claire kept going, each word measured, each phrase clipped clean. "I would also require a non-disparagement clause, tax classification of the payment, and confirmation that no alcohol consumption is expected or implied as a condition." A man 2 seats down nearly choked on his drink. The attorney actually smiled then, but not mockingly. Something closer to reluctant admiration. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" he asked. Claire closed the notepad. "The same place most women learn to read a room," she said quietly. "The hard way." Ethan's expression changed at that. Just a flicker, small enough that most people would have missed it. Claire did not. Because for the first time since he had written that number, he was no longer looking at a waitress. He was looking at a problem he could not solve with money. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Blackwell was not in control of the story anymore. The room held still around Claire Bennett like the air itself had decided not to interfere. Ethan Blackwell leaned back in his chair, but only slightly, as if distance might restore control. It did not. The black fountain pen lay beside the receipt now, suddenly ordinary, suddenly harmless, while the $1 million number on the page looked less like power and more like evidence. Claire could feel every eye in the crystal room on her, not just from Ethan's table, but from nearby booths, the bar, even the hostess stand, where 2 young servers stood frozen with menus in their hands. That was the danger of moments like this. They spread. They changed shape in other people's mouths. And once they did, no one remembered the truth. They only remembered who looked weak. Ethan folded his hands loosely in front of him. "You have given this some thought," he said, his voice lower now, smoother, stripped of the easy confidence that had colored the first offer. Claire did not sit. She did not step closer either. She stayed exactly where she was, the way people did when they knew that movement could be mistaken for surrender. "No," she said. "I have survived people who never thought things through." A faint murmur passed across the table. The attorney looked down. The public relations executive's expression sharpened. She had spent her career cleaning up powerful men's bad instincts, and she knew one when she saw it. Ethan's private equity friend tried to recover the mood with a grin. Come on, Claire, right? It was a joke. Nobody is actually drafting legal paperwork over dinner. Claire turned to him, and the smile left his face before she even spoke. That is usually what people say 5 minutes before they ask someone else to absorb the consequences. It was not loud. It was not cruel, but it landed harder than anything else she had said all night. Ethan watched her more carefully now, not with annoyance, not even with pride, with the kind of focused men like him reserved for markets turning against them. You assumed the worst of me, he said. Claire glanced at the receipt again, then at the dozen polished faces waiting for her answer. No, Mr. Blackwell, she said quietly. I assumed the worst of a room that thinks money makes humiliation elegant. That did it. One of the men looked away. Another reached for his glass and found it empty. The attorney gave the smallest possible nod, as if he hated that he agreed, but agreed all the same. Claire could feel the weight of the maitre d's gaze from across the dining room. She should have ended it. She should have apologized, smiled, walked away, and let the moment dissolve into expensive laughter. But there was a memory she could not outrun. A conference room in Midtown 3 years earlier. A woman in a navy blazer, brilliant and careful, standing alone after a holiday dinner because a harmless joke had become a blurry photograph, then a rumor, then a resignation. Claire had been an unpaid compliance intern then, 23, invisible in the corner with a legal pad in her lap, watching a career collapse because no one had written down what had really happened. She had learned something that winter. Men in power did not always mean harm. But harm did not care about intent. Harm cared about silence. Ethan's voice pulled her back. You talk like someone who has seen this before. Claire's fingers tightened once around her notepad, then relaxed. I have seen enough to know that context disappears faster than reputations recover. The public relations executive set her glass down and finally spoke directly. She is absolutely right, Ethan. If one person records this, and that number gets out without the rest of the conversation, it becomes a scandal by midnight. Ethan's jaw shifted. Not anger. Calculation. Claire saw the exact second he understood the shape of the trap he had built for himself. Not because she had embarrassed him, because she had shown him how easily the world could. She reached forward then, picked up the receipt, turned it over, and with the same black pen he had used, she wrote 7 neat words on the blank side before placing it back in front of him. He looked down. So did everyone else. The words were simple, clean, impossible to ignore. Define the role before naming the price. Ethan Blackwell stared at the receipt as if the 7 words on it had been written in a language no one had ever dared use with him before. Define the role before naming the price. The black ink looked almost elegant against the cream paper, but there was nothing decorative about the message. It was a correction, a boundary, a mirror. Around the table, no one reached for a glass. No one laughed. Even the low jazz from the piano in the corner seemed to pull farther away, as if the entire restaurant understood that something larger than a dinner joke had just shifted. Ethan lifted the receipt between 2 fingers and read it again. His face remained controlled, but Claire saw the tell in his jaw, the slight tightening that meant he was thinking harder than he wanted anyone to know. Men like him did not fear being challenged. They feared being understood too quickly. You think this is about buying a woman, he said at last, looking up at her. Claire's expression did not change. I think it became about that the second everyone around you decided it was entertaining. The words moved across the table like cold air. The private equity friend exhaled through his nose and leaned back, suddenly fascinated by the label on his wine bottle. The attorney folded his napkin with deliberate care, the small movement of a man who had decided he was no longer a spectator. The woman from public relations gave Ethan a long, unreadable look, the kind reserved for clients who had just walked one step away from a public disaster and only realized it after the floor creaked. Ethan tapped the edge of the receipt against the table once. Suppose, he said, that I was not asking for anything inappropriate. Suppose I was simply asking for conversation. Claire tilted her head just slightly. Then conversation would not need a price tag large enough to make refusal look irrational. That one landed deeper than the rest. Ethan's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with recognition. She was not reacting to the amount. She was dissecting the structure. The table could feel it now. This was not about money. It was about leverage. About the way a large number could make a woman seem foolish for saying no and dangerous for saying yes. Claire reached down and straightened the edge of the leather check folder without thinking, the movement small, automatic, precise. It was the kind of gesture no one noticed unless they were paying very close attention. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now. "You are very careful," he said. Careful is what people call women after they have watched another woman pay for someone else's carelessness. The attorney looked up at that. Fully this time. "That is a line worth billing for," he muttered under his breath. And for the first time all evening, the faintest hint of reluctant respect passed around the table. Claire did not acknowledge it. She was no longer speaking to impress anyone. She was speaking because if she stopped now, the moment would shrink into something easier, safer, and false. Ethan set the receipt down again, slower this time. "So tell me," he said, his voice quieter than before. "What exactly do you think I should have done?" It was the first real concession. Not an apology. Not yet. But a question asked without armor. Claire held his gaze. "If you wanted 10 minutes of my time, you could have asked for 10 minutes of my time. Politely. Privately. Without an audience. Without turning my answer into a performance." The words settled over the white tablecloth like truth always did when it arrived uninvited. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he glanced around the table, really seeing it for what it was. The grinning friend who had pushed the bet. The attorney who had gone quiet. The public relations executive who had already calculated 12 possible headlines. The assistants at the bar pretending not to stare. The other diners pretending not to listen. And somewhere in that long, silent sweep, the shape of his own mistake finally came into focus. When he looked back at Claire, there was no trace of the original game left in his face. "And if I asked now," he said, "without the audience, without the number." Claire studied him. Not the suit, not the watch, not the power, just the man. Then she answered in the same calm voice that had dismantled the room. "Then I would decide based on respect, Mr. Blackwell, which is much cheaper and far more rare." For the first time that evening, Ethan Blackwell did not answer immediately. He sat there with the receipt in front of him, the $1 million offer now reduced to a thin rectangle of paper and a lesson he had not expected to learn in public. The chandelier light caught the edge of his watch as he lifted his hand, then let it fall again, as if even he understood that any careless movement now would say more than words could fix. Claire Bennett remained where she was, shoulders straight, order pad still tucked at her waist, every inch of her posture communicating the same thing it had from the start. She was not waiting to be chosen. She was waiting to see who he became next. Around the table, tension changed shape. It was no longer the brittle excitement of a wealthy crowd watching a spectacle. It was quieter now, more honest. The private equity friend cleared his throat and tried once more to rescue the mood. All right, he said, with a weak smile. "This has officially become the most expensive philosophy seminar in Manhattan." No one laughed. Not even him. The attorney leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his napkin. "Actually," he said, glancing at Claire, "it is the first smart thing I have heard at this table in the last 20 minutes." That earned a small, uncomfortable shift from two of the men nearest him. The woman from public relations did not even bother hiding her agreement. "If one photo of that receipt hits social media tonight," she said evenly, "we are all spending tomorrow morning in damage control. And she still ends up looking worse than he does. That is how these stories work." Claire said nothing. She did not need to. The room was finally doing what it should have done before Ethan ever uncapped his pen. It was thinking. Ethan exhaled slowly, then turned the receipt over in his hand one last time before setting it down. "You are right," he said. The words were simple, but they hit the table harder than the original offer. Claire did not soften. Not yet. Powerful men said those words all the time when they wanted the room to move on. She had learned that too. "About what?" she asked. The question was quiet. "Exact." Ethan looked up at her, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not look like a billionaire controlling a scene. He looked like a man being forced to speak plainly. "About the audience," he said. "About the number. About making your answer part of the entertainment." He glanced briefly at the others, not to blame them, but because he finally understood how easily he had used them as cover. "That was beneath me." A stillness settled over the table, the kind that comes only when truth arrives without decoration. Claire studied his face. There was no smirk now, no challenge, just a man standing in the wreckage of his own instinct, trying to decide whether to protect his ego or his character. She had seen men choose ego before. Often. Ethan surprised her. He pushed back his chair and stood. The movement was unhurried, controlled, but everyone in the crystal room noticed. Conversations at nearby tables dimmed again. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Bennett," he said, formal now. Every word deliberate. "I owe you an apology." Even the pianist stopped playing for half a beat. Ethan reached for the receipt, folded it once, and slid it back into the leather folder. Then he set the black pen beside it, like a man putting away a weapon he had finally understood he should not have drawn. "The offer is withdrawn," he said. "Entirely." Claire held his gaze. "That is wise." A faint breath of nervous laughter moved through the table, but it was gone almost as quickly as it came. Ethan nodded once, accepting the edge in her answer because he had earned it. Then he surprised everyone again. He turned slightly toward the attorney and the public relations executive. "Tomorrow morning," he said, 8:30. "Conference room on 47th. I want a formal paid consultation drafted in advance. 10 minutes. Professional only. No audience. No games." The attorney blinked. The public relations executive looked almost impressed. "You are serious?" she asked. Ethan looked back at Claire, and his voice lowered just enough to make the room lean in. "I am trying to be." The crystal room did not erupt after Ethan Blackwell apologized. That was what made the moment real. There was no dramatic gasp, no burst of applause, no easy release. Just the quiet, uneasy shifting of expensive people forced to sit with a truth they had nearly turned into entertainment. Claire Bennett stood with one hand resting lightly against her order pad, her pulse steady now, though not because she was fearless. She had simply learned a long time ago that fear became useful the moment you stopped letting it choose your tone. Ethan remained standing for another second, then another, as if the entire room needed time to register what had just happened. A billionaire had withdrawn the offer. A waitress had not accepted the money. And somehow, the only thing that had actually changed hands was control. The public relations executive was the first to move. She set her champagne flute down and extended her hand toward Claire across the corner of the table, a gesture so unexpected that two men beside her looked almost offended by it. "Dana Mercer," she said. "And for the record, if I had been in your position, I would have asked for the contract too." Claire glanced at the hand, then shook it once. Firm. Brief. "Claire Bennett," she replied. Dana gave the smallest smile. "I know. I made sure of that the second Ethan made his mistake." That drew a dry breath of laughter from the attorney, who finally rose halfway from his chair and offered Claire a respectful nod. "Nathan Cole," he said. "I bill $900 an hour, and I am deeply annoyed that you just made a better argument than half the associates in my office." This time, even Claire allowed the faintest shift at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly, more like acknowledgement. The private equity friend looked down at his untouched dessert and muttered, "I am never speaking at dinner again." "That would be a good start," Dana said without looking at him. A few nearby diners who had clearly been pretending not to listen turned away at last, though too late to hide the fact that the story had already spread across half the room. The bartender resumed polishing a glass. The pianist found the melody again. The restaurant exhaled. But Ethan did not sit. He looked at Claire with a steadiness that was new now, stripped of spectacle, stripped of ego, almost uncomfortable in its sincerity. "I meant what I said," he told her. "Tomorrow, 8:30. Formal terms. Paid consultation. If you are willing." Claire reached down, lifted the leather folder, and closed it with one clean motion. "Willing is not the same as available, Mr. Blackwell." A few heads turned at that. Ethan, to his credit, did not flinch. "Fair," he said. "Then if you are available." Claire studied him for a moment longer. He had changed in the span of minutes, but not magically. She did not trust sudden humility. She trusted patterns. Still, there was something in the way he was standing now, no longer using the table as a throne, no longer speaking to perform for anyone else, that felt less like charm and more like effort. The rare kind. "I work breakfast service," she said at last. 7 to 11. Ethan glanced at Nathan. "Move the meeting to noon." Nathan did not even blink. "Done." Claire almost laughed at that, but she did not. Men like Ethan could rearrange buildings with a sentence. That was exactly why she had forced him to learn the cost of using one carelessly. Dana folded her arms and looked between them. If this actually happens, she said, I want it noted for history that a server in Midtown taught a room full of executives what compliance should sound like. Claire picked up the black pen Ethan had left beside the folder and held it out to him. He took it carefully, their fingers not touching, and she spoke in the same calm voice that had changed the entire night. You do not need me tomorrow because I am difficult, Mr. Blackwell. You need me because your instincts are expensive. That finally did it. Ethan smiled. Not the polished smile from earlier. Not the one that came from winning. This one was smaller, quieter, almost embarrassed. I am beginning to notice, he said. And for the first time all evening, Claire believed he might. By the time Claire Bennett stepped away from Ethan Blackwell's table, the crystal room had returned to motion, but not to normal. Normal had left 10 minutes ago and was not coming back. The pianist played softer now, as if the room itself had become more careful. Silverware moved again. Low conversations resumed. A waiter near the bar nearly walked into a column because he was still watching Claire out of the corner of his eye. She ignored all of it. That was the part people never understood. Winning a moment did not excuse you from finishing your shift. She collected a tray from the service station, balanced 2 espresso cups, a lemon tart, and a side of fresh berries, then moved toward table 14 as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Her steps were measured. Her shoulders relaxed. The same quiet competence as before. But under the calm, something older had stirred loose. Not pride, not satisfaction, memory. As she set the dessert plate in front of an older couple celebrating an anniversary, she heard the woman whisper, That is the young lady, right? The husband nodded without looking at Claire directly. Handled herself better than anyone in that corner ever has. Claire gave them a polite smile and stepped away before kindness could become conversation. She had learned to be wary of both. At the service station, another server named Melissa grabbed her arm lightly, eyes wide. Claire, she hissed, voice barely above a whisper. What in the world just happened? Claire reached for the ticket spindle and scanned the next order without looking up. Table 9 still needs sparkling water, she said. Melissa blinked. That is not an answer. It is the only useful thing happening right now. Melissa stared at her for another beat, then let out a breath that was half admiration, half disbelief. You know the entire staff is going to talk about this for months. Claire tore the next ticket cleanly and tucked it into place. Then they should at least get the details right. The words came out sharper than she intended, and Melissa went quiet. Claire regretted it instantly, but not enough to explain. She had spent too many years learning what happened when a woman became a story before she became a witness. Across the dining room, Ethan was still standing beside his chair, though his table had finally resumed the fragile choreography of expensive people pretending they had not just been corrected by someone in an apron. Nathan Cole was speaking to him now, low and serious. Dana Mercer was already typing something into her phone, likely rewriting tomorrow before it had the chance to embarrass anyone. The loud friend who had helped start the bet was suddenly very interested in his dessert spoon. Ethan looked up once, caught Claire moving past the bar with a tray in hand, and did not call after her. That mattered, more than most people would think. Men like him often mistook access for resolution. She had not forgiven him. She had not accepted anything. She had simply allowed him the dignity of trying again later, if he meant it. At 10:47 p.m., the rush began to thin. The final wave of late reservations had been seated. The chandeliers seemed warmer now, the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows blurring against the dark Manhattan glass. Claire slipped into the side corridor near the kitchen for exactly 20 seconds, just long enough to press 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathe. The walls back there were plain, painted a neutral cream no one ever noticed, the kind of hallway that held more truths than the dining room ever would. Her phone buzzed once inside her apron pocket. She glanced at the screen. One text, from an unknown number. She almost ignored it. Almost. But something in her chest tightened before she even opened it. When she did, there were only 9 words on the screen. Noon tomorrow. Formal terms. No games. Ethan. Claire stared at the message, thumb still, expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she locked the phone and slid it back into her apron. No smile. No sigh. No dramatic pause. She picked up a polished silver tray from the side shelf and stepped back into the light. Because whatever happened tomorrow, tonight still had 3 tables, 2 checks, and 1 final lesson left to serve. The last hour of service always revealed who people really were. Not at the beginning, when the room was polished and everyone still cared about posture, but near closing, when ties loosened, lipstick faded, patience thinned, and the truth started showing through the edges. Claire Bennett had always liked that part. It was easier to trust people when they were tired. By 11:18 p.m., the crystal room had softened into its final rhythm. A pair of venture capitalists argued quietly over dessert. An older couple lingered over decaf and anniversary memories. The bar glowed amber and gold beneath mirrored shelves, half empty now, the kind of beauty that only looked effortless because someone had worked very hard to keep it that way. Claire moved through it with her usual precision, but her mind kept circling back to the text in her apron pocket. Noon tomorrow. Formal terms. No games. Ethan. 3 short sentences. Cleaner than his first offer. Smarter too. He had learned, at least enough to know that tone was part of the contract. At table 6, a silver-haired woman in a navy silk blouse set down her spoon and watched Claire approach with the check. "You are the one," she said softly, not as gossip but as recognition. Claire placed the folder beside the coffee cup. "I am the one bringing you the bill, ma'am." The woman smiled, a little sadly. "No, you are the one who made that man look at himself." Her husband shifted in his seat, perhaps embarrassed by how direct his wife was being, but she did not stop. "I spent 30 years in corporate law," she added. "You were not protecting your dignity. You were protecting evidence." Claire's fingers paused on the edge of the tablecloth. For the first time that night, someone had named it exactly. Not flirtation, not pride, not defiance. Evidence. The woman reached into her purse and pulled out a slim ivory business card, setting it on top of the folder with 2 manicured fingers. "Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "Retired now, but not irrelevant. If tomorrow turns into something less formal than promised, call me before you call anyone else." Claire looked down at the card. Whitmore and Hales, LLP. Her throat tightened in a way she hated, subtle and brief, and almost invisible. "That is generous," she said. Eleanor's eyes sharpened. "No, dear. That is strategic. Generosity is what people call it when women protect each other and men are not paying attention." Claire slipped the card into her apron with a nod. "Thank you." When she turned away, she caught her reflection for a split second in the mirrored panel near the bar. White shirt, black vest, hair still pinned back, though a few pale strands had escaped near her temple. A woman who looked ordinary enough to be dismissed, until she opened her mouth. She almost smiled at that, but the moment passed. At 11:34 p.m., Ethan's table finally stood to leave. Chairs shifted back over polished wood. Jackets were collected. Credit cards reappeared. Nathan Cole gave Claire a small nod on his way out, the quiet acknowledgement of one professional to another. Dana Mercer paused just long enough to say, "If he does anything performative tomorrow, I will know before he does." Then she was gone, heels sharp against the marble entry. The loud friend avoided Claire entirely. Ethan was the last to move. He signed the final bill without flourish, no extra note, no oversized tip slipped in like an apology pretending to be generosity. That, more than anything, surprised her. When he stood, he placed the pen down carefully and closed the folder. Then he walked toward her, but stopped at a respectful distance. 3 feet, maybe 4. Enough space to say he had learned something. "I did not add anything," he said quietly, glancing at the folder. "No grand gesture. I assumed that would be unwelcome." Claire looked at him, then at the folder, then back again. "Correct." A small breath of laughter escaped him. "Not polished. Not practiced. Human." "Noon," he said. "You can still say no." Claire lifted the folder, opened it, and saw the exact total. Exact tip. 20%. Standard. Clean. Professional. She closed it again. "That," she said, meeting his eyes, "is the first interesting thing you have done all night." Ethan nodded once, as if the words mattered more than approval. Then he stepped back, gave her a brief, respectful incline of his head, and walked out into the Manhattan night without asking for anything else. Claire watched the revolving door spin once, twice, then settle. In the silence that followed, she looked down at the folder in her hands and understood something she had not expected. He had finally left her with a choice. And sometimes, in rooms built on power, that was the rarest form of respect. At 12:07 a.m., the crystal room was finally empty enough to tell the truth. The last candle at the bar burned lower, throwing soft gold across the mirrored shelves. Chairs were being reset. Linen napkins disappeared into gray bins. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone laughed too loudly from exhaustion, the sound bouncing off stainless steel before fading into the late-night hush that only restaurants understood. Claire Bennett stood alone at the service station with Ethan Blackwell's clothes check folder in one hand and a damp polishing cloth in the other, looking not at the total, but at the stillness around it. 20%. Exact. No extra zeros. No handwritten note. No dramatic flourish. It should not have impressed her. And yet, somehow it did. Not because it was generous. Because it was disciplined. Melissa slid in beside her with a stack of water glasses and a stare that could have peeled paint. Please tell me you are going to explain tonight before I die from curiosity. Claire picked up the folder, removed the signed receipt, and placed it neatly in the cash-out tray. A wealthy man made a mistake, she said. Then he made a smaller one. Melissa groaned. That is not a real explanation. Claire wiped the edge of the station counter in one clean motion. It is the most accurate one. Melissa leaned closer, lowering her voice. So what now? You going to that meeting? Claire did not answer immediately. She folded the polishing cloth in half, then in half again, because hands needed tasks when thoughts became too loud. Noon tomorrow. Formal terms. No games. She could still see the words in her mind, spare and deliberate, cleaner than anything else he had offered. Across from the cash register, the mirrored panel caught her reflection again. Same uniform, same pinned hair, same face people dismissed until it inconvenienced them. But tonight had changed something she had spent years keeping buried under routine. Not hope. She was too smart for that. But possibility. Dangerous thing. Expensive thing. I have not decided, she said at last. Melissa studied her, then surprised her by nodding instead of pushing. If you do go, she said, wear the face you used tonight. That face could sue a building. Claire almost laughed. Almost. Good advice. At 12:19 a.m., the manager, Victor Lang, called her into the small office behind the hostess stand. Most employees hated that room. Too beige. Too quiet. Too many conversations that ended badly. Victor sat behind a walnut desk with his reading glasses low on his nose, the nightly sales report glowing on his screen. He was a man in his 50s who believed in polished shoes, folded pocket squares, and never discussing personal feelings unless they threatened table turnover. He looked up as Claire stepped in, then removed his glasses slowly. Close the door, please. Claire did. He folded his hands. I have been in this industry for 27 years, he said, and I have never once watched a guest get professionally dismantled with such remarkable courtesy. Claire said nothing. Victor exhaled, glancing toward the dining room beyond the frosted glass. You were not insubordinate. You were not rude. You were, in fact, entirely correct. He paused, which meant something difficult was coming. Still, men like Ethan Blackwell are not ordinary guests. Claire held his gaze. Neither are ordinary mistakes. Victor's mouth twitched, the closest he ever came to a smile during conflict. Fair. He slid a small envelope across the desk. Dana Mercer left this with the host. She said to give it to you only after the room cleared. Claire took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single cream card with elegant lettering and one handwritten line beneath the printed contact information. If he changes the terms, walk out. If he keeps them, make him earn minute 11. Claire read it twice. Not because she needed to. Because she recognized the voice in it. Strategic. Sharp. Protective without sentimentality. She tucked the card into her apron beside Eleanor Whitmore's. 2 women. 2 warnings. Both more valuable than any tip she had earned that night. When she looked up, Victor was watching her with an expression she could not quite name. Whatever you do tomorrow, he said quietly, do not go as someone grateful to be invited. Claire placed the envelope on the desk and straightened it until the edges aligned with the grain of the wood. I was not invited, she said. I was corrected into relevance. Victor blinked once, then leaned back in his chair, almost impressed. That, he murmured, is exactly why you should go. Claire stepped out of the office a minute later and into the dim, nearly empty dining room. The chandeliers had been lowered to half-light. The city beyond the glass looked cold and silver. Manhattan stretched beneath the midnight sky, like a promise no one should trust too easily. She slipped both cards deeper into her apron, reached for her coat from the staff hook, and paused by the front door for just 1 second. Not because she was afraid, because she understood what tomorrow really was. Not a meeting, not an opportunity, a test still, just a different kind. And as Claire Bennett stepped out into the crisp New York night, one thing was finally clear. Ethan Blackwell had offered money when he wanted control. Tomorrow, if he wanted her time, he would have to offer something far more difficult. Proof.